As we wait for the rest of the people to come in, I'd firstly like to start by thanking everybody for their continued support of the ERC and welcome everybody back really after our break over the summer to our first talk of the academic year. We're extremely pleased to have Özlem Onaran here today with us, kicking off this programme. As we try to look more towards economic pluralism. And this will be expressed in our upcoming events as well. The next one of those being on the 28th of September with Andrew Meerman. He'll be discussing the necessity of economic pluralism and the case for heterodoxy in economics as well. So back to today's event. As usual, we'll have a 30-minute talk by our speaker and then a roughly 30-minute Q&A as well. As the talk is going on, please do feel free to type any questions that you have into the Q&A box and also to do that at the end of the talk as well, so that I can pick those up and give those to our speaker. As mentioned before, our speaker today is Özlem Onaran. She's a professor of economics at the University of Greenwich, and she also serves as the director of the Greenwich Political Economy Research Centre. And her talk today is based on research that she has conducted on the employment effects of public spending in infrastructure, the care economy and the green economy as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Özlem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for inviting me. Great to start the academic year with you and your audience, your membership. Hopefully this is showing off, and one gets always a bit rusted after an annual leave, but yeah, I'm hoping I'm in the presentation mode now. I'll try to give you a broad overview of the mix of economic policies for what I call a green, caring, just transition. The research we have been doing at Greenwich will be forming the background, but I'll be sharing mostly the results and the punchline with you rather than going into the technical details of the model or statistical econometric data analysis. There are theoretical models and econometric research behind that, and there are a couple of selected papers that are in the slides if you want to have a look at them later. These are the two main research papers that I have done with my colleague Cem Oyvat and Eurydice Fotopoulou at Greenwich, but there are a few other things I'll be dwelling into as well. The background of my interest in this is the big picture where we are finding ourselves in the current context in the world and in Britain. It often looks like a really dystopian science fiction film to me, but sadly, it is not science fiction. It is happening now. The world economy and societies are facing multiple challenges, ecological breakdown at the heart of that, and care needs in an aging society in the context of both developed and emerging economies and newly emerging economies too, becoming a burning emergency. These are intermingling with long-standing other big challenges in terms of intersecting inequalities in terms of class, race, and gender, in addition to regional and cross-country international inequalities. And this is now happening all in the context of a new and a different phase of technological change with the rise of artificial intelligence. And I think it is fair to say technological change is something we know since Industrial Revolution. There has been also technological change that came with intensive use of communication and information technology in the late 80s, 90s. But I think it is fair to say that this time it is different. On top of these mega challenges, there are also other new events that have put more geopolitical tensions in the world economy and our societies. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is sadly nowhere close to coming to a peaceful end. And of course, this is bringing to the forefront again issues of renewable energy, energy sovereignty, and independence from fossil fuels. In relation to that, but also in relation to the climate crisis, we have had the deepest cost of living crisis of our generation, and all these crises are interlinked. We cannot solve any of them on their own. And if we try to do that, we will be deepening the other crises if we just try to tackle one of these in isolation. So that brings me to the question of what is to be done. What is to be done would require a big paradigm shift if we are to get out of these multiple crises by a green, caring, as well as just transition, tackling the ecological crisis, the care crisis, but also inequalities. That will require being really imaginative. And if I could sing better, and I wish I could, I would like to sing you Imagine. Imagine, in this case, a world where we think of economic policy totally differently. We start by the needs rather than some artificially made up targets, which may or may not serve any of these green, caring, just transition targets. Instead, let's think of what are the needs of our societies. For example, let's ask the question, how much investment do we need in the green economy to make sure that we achieve the transition to net zero carbon economy in the correct time, such that we don't fall off the cliff to irreversible damage and irreversible climate catastrophe. Or we should ask ourselves the question, how many care workers do we need to meet the demographic needs of our society, while at the same time honoring the very important, crucial work of our key care workers by paying them the decent pay that labor really deserves. In a way, value what matters, value that adequately, and deliver to the communities, people's needs in terms of care needs. And the list can be extended, and we need a democratic discussion about what are our needs. So then let's start by looking for policies that will address all of them. That would require using all the tools that we have in our toolkit in terms of economic policy. And that would mean that we will need to use all the means of funding. From an economic policy point of view, that would need using, at the same time, fiscal policy, monetary policy, industrial policy, labor market policies, and social policies, and making sure they coordinate with each other. And while doing that, we should avoid a competition between these needs. We need the investment in the green economy at the same time as investment in the care economy. We need to tackle inequalities. We need to make sure that we have food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, all at the same time. And let's also be creative and make sure that while we are using all these policies, they complement each other and help us to answer all these or meet all these needs. That requires long-run thinking, not just running after one crisis management to the next. Obviously, we always will need to tackle short-run emergency needs that we haven't anticipated, such as the war in Ukraine, and things that came with it would require a certain set of policies that would tackle the cost of living crisis, inequalities around it here and now, or policies to tackle the pandemic and the fallout in terms of economic and social issues, as well as health emergencies. But we need to have an eye on where do we want to go in terms of transition and the medium run. We can't say, oh, we will only think of the medium run transition, and once we achieve that transition, the short run emergency problems will be sorted. We need to tackle the short run, but we need to have the eye on long run thinking. And I'm going to give some precise examples around these policies, and I will make it clear. But the big idea here is that we can't continue to implement the policies in terms of fiscal conservatism, fiscal austerity, budget constraints as a taboo, central bank independence as a taboo, and hope that we will be able to tackle climate change, inequalities, care crisis in the age of artificial intelligence. That's not going to happen. So we need big thinking and paradigm shift to what I call a needs-based policy making. My way of trying to show how policies can help us tackle these crises at the same time is to work with models and build on theory, but then bring them to empirical terrain, empirically estimate them for a variety of economies. The theoretical framework I've been working with, I'm not going to talk about it longer than just this slide, is in the tradition of structuralist economics. To be precise, it follows a post-Keynesian theoretical framework, learning a lot from Michal Kalecki's work, who has worked along with Keynes, so he's one of the prominent post-Keynesians. And one of our contributions at Greenwich has been to extend these structuralist models to bring in multiple dimensions of inequalities and, in particular, gender dimension into these models. So I call them structuralist or post-Keynesian gendered macro models. The essence of these models are that they belong to a family where economic activity is driven by demand. So they are demand-led growth models, and we have published some very recent work around that, which I share with you at the end of the slides. Demand-led growth model means demand constraints matter in the economy. If we have excess capacity in terms of productive capacity of machinery and equipment, a stimulus to demand will bring the economy closer to full employment. Or reversely, if there is excess capacity in the economy, alone supply-side policies will not help to solve crises in terms of unemployment or inequalities. In economies under normal conditions, market economies with these demand constraints, excess capacity is rather the norm than the exception, which means that a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they are unemployed involuntarily. It's not a choice for leisure for them. They're not choosing it. They would like to work, but there's not enough jobs to hire them. In such a context, fiscal policy is a very potent policy tool. Public spending can actually fill in that demand deficiency. So it creates demand. Together with that, it creates jobs. And given that public spending will not be neutral in terms of who benefits from it as the users, what kind of jobs are being created for what kind of people, men versus women, what type of skill levels, regions, it will have an impact on inequalities. It will have an effect on income distribution. And actually, demand side, or a stimulus to the demand side, or for that matter, on the negative side, a deficiency on the demand side, matters for the supply side as well. Firms' investment will be stimulated if there is a stimulus to demand. If that comes from the public sector spending, that will be something that will be good for private investment as well. Investment is the driver of improvements in productivity. So the supply side actually is affected by demand as well. Similarly, labor supply will be affected by public spending or the lack of it, as the case may be. If you think about the care economy, I said care deficit. If your society, your household has certain care needs because of young children in the household, or elderly that need care, or disabled people, those needs won't be taken care of on their own. Somebody has to provide that care. If there's not adequate provision of publicly provided social care, health care, education, or childcare, in our current gender division of labor, women are providing that care labor invisibly, unpaid in the domestic sphere, and that does actually create a constraint in terms of the labor supply of women, even when they would choose to supply their labor for paid work in the market economy. They wouldn't be able to do that to their full capacity if the care needs are not otherwise being taken care of by public provision of care services. Hence, what the demand side does, what the public sector does, has implications for labor supply. It might be a constraint if there is inadequate public provision of the care economy in terms of labor supply. And these models are also important in terms of the different role they attach to income distribution, in particular wages. Post-Keynesian economics is very different from mainstream neoclassically informed models, attach a dual role to wages. In mainstream thinking, wages are just a cost, whereas in the post-Keynesian models, they have a dual role. So they're not just a cost, but they are also a source of demand, a very important source of demand, because wage earners would consume a higher share of their wage compared to the higher income earning, profit income earning, or top 1% richer households. So in this context, both the distribution of income and wealth matters, and actually distribution of income and wealth between men and women also matters. So gender pay gaps, as well as gender employment gaps that translate into gender income gaps, matter, because women and men have also different behavior when it comes to where they spend their income. Women tend to spend more of their income in things that are conducive to improving the nutrition, education, and health outcomes of the children in the household and in general household. So these mean different things in terms of building productive human capabilities. Hence, income and wealth distribution have effect on both the demand side and the supply side, on the productivity side of things. And in all this context, they are structuralist models because the structure of the economy in terms of the sectoral composition, import dependency, gendered occupational segregation in different sectors, oligopoly power, market power of firms, bargaining power of workers in wage negotiations, the provision or the deficiency in public infrastructure, all make a difference on both the effects on aggregate demand and supply productivity in the economy. So I'm very happy to discuss about the details of what this modeling mean, but maybe it would be better to focus on one element of policy and see how that will affect our demand and supply side of our economy, and keeping the eye on the big picture problem or challenge of the multiple challenges and the need for a green, caring, just transition. The important thing for me to highlight here is the most powerful policy here that paves the way to a transition, the locomotive policy, is public spending as part of fiscal policy. It has to be part of a broader policy mix, but it is one of the most effective policies in terms of providing solutions to both the climate, care, and inequalities crises while achieving a timely, urgent, large-scale intervention towards transition. So it's in a way leading the way if you tap into public investment. It opens options for all the other policies and private investment behavior as well. And it has to be well targeted. It has to come at a large scale and as quick, as urgent as possible. And it can happen much quicker than private investment that depends on private profit motives can achieve. And the targeting of it is important. And here is some 3 areas where we can really address the multiple challenges I started with. The first is public investment in the green economy. With that, I mean investment in the renewable energy, improving the energy efficiency of industry, as well as energy use in the households, in the existing building stock, investing in public transport, but also investing in organic agriculture to foster more options for plant-based organic nutrition, investing in forestry to make sure that we can capture the carbon in the atmosphere, and investing in also repair, circular economy, rather than the old idea of manufacture new things, use, and then trash. The second key area is the purple care economy. Feminist economists call that also infrastructure, if you like. This is the social infrastructure, whereas the first part in the green economy mostly is referring to physical infrastructure. That purple care infrastructure is simply provision of services in education, childcare, healthcare, and social care. We have other physical infrastructure needs too, for example, social housing, and that has to now have a green nature, as in we know the technologies for having zero energy or even active energy houses. Of course, if we are going to provide purple care provision, we need also the buildings for that, which would be investing in hospitals, schools, nurseries, and care homes. Now, the crucial complementarities, often people tend to think about these as, or we need to prioritize one because it's urgent. Well, actually, no, because particularly purple and the green economy are complementary. If we are to achieve a timely, urgent redeployment away from brown, dirty, fossil fuel sectors, care jobs are part of the solution because they are clean jobs. They're very low in carbon emissions. They are labor intensive, as in with £1 of investment, you can create a lot more jobs compared to more capital intensive jobs in the other side of infrastructure. It's not a competition, it's a complementarity. We need both. We need all of them urgently now, and therefore we need a big bang transition that is triggered by public investment that shows the way. Well, that then brings, of course, always the question, how can that be funded? And it is an important question, and we need to have solid answers to that, hence the need for modeling and also statistical econometric analysis to answer such questions. The good news is, first of all, partly it will self-finance. And why it will self-finance? What does it mean from a macroeconomic perspective? A very crucial Keynesian idea of macroeconomic multiplier. If the public sector spends £1 in the green economy or purple economy, this will create more than £1 national income. And therefore, by even if you do not increase the tax rates on income, you will be able to collect more tax revenues as the government. It is not a magic money tree. It will not self-fund all of itself. If you spend £1, my econometric analysis for Britain looks like you will be able to get about half of it back, £0.5, 50p back, thanks to this high multiplier effects of green or purple public spending. So there is money, But you will need to use all the other possible tools, as I started with that paradigm shift idea. What are the other tools in our kit in terms of funding? Of course, the most important tool is taxation. So we will need to increase some tax rates because the good old multiplier is only so much good. It will only fund about half of itself in the British case. In some more import-dependent, smaller economies, that will be smaller according to my estimations. So we need to, however, make sure that the taxation is progressive. It falls more on the shoulders that are broader. So those who have more income will be paying a higher tax rate compared to those at the bottom of the distribution. And most importantly, we need to start talking seriously about taxing not just income, but also wealth. And I'll say a few more things about it later, because it is actually a current discussion that very unexpected partners, such as the millionaires in Britain, a group called Patriotic Millionaires, are becoming positively a party to. These policies are important. It takes time, maybe within the lifetime of a government, it's possible to implement these policies of new taxation systems and go after tax evasion and avoidance and raise sufficient amounts of funding. But the spending is urgent and it has to start on day zero of a government. So that means you will need to also borrow. It is okay if you're borrowing to invest in something that will have a return to the society and the economy and the government budget in the next couple of years. So usually we have fiscal credibility rules where we say it's okay to borrow for capital investment. However, going back to my point about the urgencies in terms of multiple challenges in terms of both climate change, but also the care economy and inequalities intersecting across class, gender, and race, there is we need a lot of spending in all the areas. So the old school idea that it's okay to borrow if you are going to invest in physical infrastructure doesn't address the new emergencies and the new understanding we have about what is infrastructure. Because now we know very well the care economy, the nurses we have, the childcare workers, social care workers we have also contribute to a society's productivity. It has strong labor supply stimulus effects. And actually, it's very important for social fabric as well. So social infrastructure is as key infrastructure as your physical infrastructure. Hence, it would be important to redefine or broaden our understanding of infrastructure and broaden our fiscal credibility rules. So borrowing to hire more nurses and pay them higher wages, or hire more nursery teachers or social care workers and pay them a salary that is valuing their worth to our society adequately, are all legitimate ways of or legitimate reasons to borrow. Mind you, I am putting that still in my third point in the bullet list. I wouldn't want to rely only on borrowing, because borrowing means you're not taxing some of those parts of the society who have ability to pay higher taxes sufficiently. You have to tax those at the top 1% in terms of wealth and income distribution a lot more adequately than we are doing currently. But as you're doing that transition, you will need to borrow. Spending needs might be a lot bigger than what you can raise within the first 2 years of a government. Mind you, I'm going back to the paradigm shift idea. I'm starting with the needs of the society. Let's ask ourselves, what is the annual spending we need in the green and the care economy, or housing, or in hospital buildings or school buildings? And then limiting how much I can raise by increasing which tax rate in a way that tackles also inequalities. And then let me acknowledge that I may have to cover the slack by borrowing, after correctly acknowledging that there will be some gains in terms of taxation revenues from the good multiplier effects as well. There are, of course, other clever ways of funding our investment mobilization. National investment banks, development banks have been used very widely in the world. These should be a network of public banks, ideally also networking with cooperative banks, savings unions, credit unions, and these can further leverage investment funding for both the public sector as well as, of course, stimulate private investment in the key targeted areas. Last but not least, a lot of recent macroeconomic policy intervention has been heavy lifted by monetary policy interventions of the central banks in Britain, but also in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere in the world. What we know and what we have very sadly observed over and over since the Great Crash, monetary policy is actually not as effective as fiscal policy could have been. It did the heavy lifting, but it is a lot more limited than what a fiscal policy, public investment mobilization could have achieved. It did the job when there was very little fiscal policy stimulus. And monetary policy, particularly since the cost of living crisis, has been wrongly very much timed with a very narrow focus on as low as possible inflation target, losing the sight over a target about employment and economic activity. What I'm suggesting here is the following. Monetary policy will always be the smaller sister of these two between fiscal and monetary policy in terms of its effectiveness and potency. So let that actually, therefore, be accommodating the fiscal policy, follow what the fiscal policy needs, public investment needs are, and have a dual target in terms of both targeting employment, full employment with decent wages and inflation. That would mean the Bank of England or other central banks should be buying government bonds to directly also fund part of the public investment drive in the primary markets, whereas currently central bank independence taboo implies that they can only buy government bonds in the secondary market from private banks who had both the government bond in the primary market when the government was first borrowing. We need to facilitate, if need be, government's public investment in a targeted fashion if we are to achieve that big bank mobilization of investment to tackle the multiple crises. And in my opinion, inflation target has been overrated. Quite on the contrary, if we have a dual target, there has to be a heavier weight attached on employment. If we are going to get serious about existing class, gender, and race inequalities. And that would mean also to have an inflation target that would be consistent with what a full employment target needs. In my opinion, that's not going to be 2% or as low as possible. That only serves honestly the interests of people who are living on interest and rent income. If you're living on a wage income, you would benefit from having an environment of very high employment rates and very low unemployment, frictional unemployment only. And that's more likely to be consistent with an inflation target of about 4 or 5%. As long as this is predictable and stable, and as long as labor market institutions make sure that wages are improving along with inflation and productivity, this is not gonna hurt anyone. It will also not hurt the long-term supply side growth potential of the economy. So I have already said that this idea is all about putting monetary policy in its place. It has a place, but it has to accommodate fiscal policy mobilization. I had a long diagram where I'm trying to explain how a public spending mobilization in the care and green economy and renewable energy, energy efficiency, and public transport can positively affect the demand side. Together with that, it can positively affect employment of men and women and their wages. That would have some, of course, effects on prices, which may have some negative feedback on demand. In our estimations, those effects tend to be small. Public provision of particularly care economy decreases the unpaid care needs in the household, and that, of course, improves the labor supply of women. All of these improvements in both demand in the short run, improvements in the income of and employment of men and women, do have positive effects on labor productivity in the medium run on the supply side. And in the medium run, an increase in labor productivity is, of course, good for aggregate demand, and it's good for also inflation, because for a given wage rise, if you are becoming also more productive, your unit labor cost will not be increasing as much. So the inflationary effect of any stimulus in the short run is timed or offset in the medium run by some productivity gains too. Now, the one thing that is important to understand here, of course, productivity increases, technological change is a blessing, but we need to be mindful of what that will mean for employment as well. While you stimulate the economy by public spending, you create demand for labor, you create employment, but you also decrease the number of workers you need to produce a certain amount of output and create a certain amount of national income. So obviously productivity increase means that employment creating effect of any demand stimulus will be slightly offset. In my experience, that's not one-to-one. So public sector demand effect is so strong that despite a very strong positive productivity stimulus, you will still get also a rise in women's and men's employment. What kind of stimulus you make has very gendered effects. Hence, very important it is to mix these policies if you're interested in creating jobs for both men and women. So what we did was to a macroeconometric analysis of this. What I'm sharing here with you in terms of numbers is the model, the results for the British case. We have worked with emerging economies more recently with my colleague Jem Oyvat as well for a project we have done for the International Trade Union Confederation. That David was referring to that in his introduction, and this is something we have done for the Economic and Social Research Council Rebuilding Macroeconomics program. So what we did was a policy mix of basically three sets of policies. One is labor market policies that would achieve an increase in the hourly real wage rate of both men and women. And while doing that, it will achieve also a closing of gender pay gaps. So it's an upward convergence. How that happens, actually trade unions achieve that all the time in their negotiations, because they usually negotiate for a higher pay rise for people who are on the lower part of the wage distribution, and women are often concentrated in that segment. So trade unions are really good for an upward convergence in terms of increasing wage rates for both men and women while closing gender pay gaps. Higher minimum wages would help a lot in that direction as well, and also regulations that are for equal pay for equal value of work. The second set of policies are the fiscal policies that I have talked in length before. This is government spending in both the social purple and physical green infrastructure. The stimulus we were doing here is let's increase these by 1 percentage point of GDP every year, while at the same time increasing wage rates of women by 2% in terms of real wages, of men by 1%. These are real wages, meaning 1% nominal wage rise above inflation for men, 2% for women. I'm just repeating maybe here, just to clarify here, what I mean by government spending in the purple economy is hire more nurses, more care workers, teachers, and pay them a higher wage rate and close the gender pay gaps. At the same time, invest in renewable energy, in wind farms, solar energy, tidal energy, geothermal energy, increase energy efficiency of the grid, of the industries, of the building stocks, insulate the houses or support programs for insulation, and invest in public transport. So that's where the spending will be targeted. The third is about the taxation dimension of fiscal policy, that is improving the progressivity of income and wealth taxation. In Britain, what we simulated was a 1 percentage point increase on the tax rate on wealth. Mind you, currently tax rate on wealth in Britain is a bit less than 1%. So by increasing that by 1 percentage point, we are doubling it. That's not as high as you would think. It is what it was back in the late 1970s. It has declined substantially since the 1980s. And it's by all means not impossible. I'm going to give you a small example of how you can do that in a progressive way. And in the simulations, we are looking at increasing the tax rate on profit income by 1 percentage point, while decreasing the tax rate on wage income by 1 percentage point. An example of progressive income taxation. So what we find is the following: impact on employment and in total income of the economy coming from fiscal policy stimulus, that purple and green spending is very strong. Overall, in total, out of this three policy mix, we are getting in Britain a rise in hourly hours of work of women by about 10%, hours of work of men by about 6%. There's a very strong stimulus to productivity. Impact of this on inflation is quite modest. It would raise inflation by 2 percentage points. So if the target of central bank is 2, that's going to bring it to 4. And I think this is what is consistent with full employment, or more consistent with full employment. In Europe, we have done some simulations elsewhere for the European Union member states. That inflation effect was even less. It was 1.5%. It is this policy mix of both taxation and improving wage rates, despite a very strong fiscal spending stimulus, is improving public finances. Public debt to GDP ratio is falling incredibly substantially by about 10 percentage points. So public spending is really partly self-financing, even without the tax increases on wealth and profit income. But if you mix fiscal policy stimulus with increasing wages and progressive income and wealth taxation, you're achieving really substantial improvement in public finances. Wealth tax is particularly strong. Taxing profits while decreasing taxes on wages has also a positive stimulus on aggregate national income and public finances. Interestingly, what I want to emphasize is wealth tax is actually also stimulating private investment. Maybe a few words are in place here, because that's one of the current policy debates as well.
Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, we're going to need to wrap things up shortly, I'm afraid.
Okay, then let me go over maybe just the effect of wealth tax, and then I'm going to summarize, maybe in 3 minutes, if that's all right. So what does an increase in wealth tax do? It actually decreases wealth inequality, decreases the concentration of wealth at the top of 1% of the wealth distribution. And it does stimulate private investment, because that wealth concentration is actually leading to all kinds of negative things that are not good for investment of the bottom 99% of the investors or medium scale or small enterprises. Because wealth concentration comes with financial speculation, financialization, oligopolistic market concentration, these mean barriers to entry, and these are barriers to innovation and investment. So when you tax wealth, you're not just creating funding, but you're also creating a very positive stimulus to investment and demand, and thereby output, and it's creating more jobs for women and men and improving your budget balances. I did say that more progressive income taxation is also good for the economy. Well, this is because Britain grows with more equality, and it actually contracts or stagnates with more inequality. Progressive taxation means more equality, and it's good for jobs, it's good for aggregate income in Britain. We have crunched some numbers for an example of particularly a progressive tax model for the top 1% of the wealthiest households. This is basically households that have a net wealth minus liabilities, or assets minus liabilities, that are about 3.4 million pounds in Britain. There are about 260,000 households there. If we were to put a 1% tax on their wealth and increase that gradually as you go to the top 0.5% and further to 0.1%, even when you account for administration costs, some tax avoidance or evasion, we are able to, looking at the microdata from Wealth Survey of Britain, we're able to see that we can raise about 70 or even 130 billion pounds a year from this simple example of wealth taxation. That's actually about 9 to 16% of our tax revenues. So there's a lot of green and purple investment you could fund with that. Okay, I'm gonna skip what has to be done in the short run in terms of tackling the cost of living crisis. Other examples of labor market policies, I touched upon some of them, but just conclude by saying what we need for a green and caring just transition with full employment and decent jobs to tackle the multiple crises is foremost public investment, a shift to needs-based policy that needs to be funded by all the tools we have, ranging from progressive taxation of not just income, but also wealth, but also other tools such as National Investment Bank and monetary policy with a dual mandate, focusing particularly on employment and not just inflation. Green and care jobs are important for transition because they are the jobs, if we are to move away from fossil fuel-based sectors, those people will be redeployed in those new industries of green and care economy. And those purple and green jobs are not competing, but they're complementary. We need to create both of them. I had some notes in my previous slides about the labor market policies and how shortening of the work week is an essential part of the mix, but maybe we can discuss it later. In the short run, all these medium run policies are good, but in the here and now, we really need to tackle the cost of living crisis by thinking of price controls in terms of energy, rent, and essential food. Food inflation in Britain is still around 15%, and a higher minimum wage, if I am to list one important labor market policy, is again part of those emergency policies, but also essential for long run. And in the long run, if we are to think about tackling inequalities, it is important to have a policy framework that improves productivity, that of course creates the why for wages increasing along with productivity rather than lagging behind productivity. And this is key to stabilizing demand in the economy too. All that can though only happen in a just way if we correct the existing inequality and existing real wage losses, existing losses in the share of wage income in national income, and productivity itself can be stimulated substantially by public investment as well. Thanks for your patience. I'm gonna stop here, and I'm very happy to pick up whichever parts I have missed or any questions you might have on the parts I have covered. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Özlem. I really appreciate that. Very insightful talk about crucial problems that we face and some very interesting solutions to those as well. I do have some questions of my own. I'm going to let people type any questions that they have into the Q&A section, and I can address those. But before I go on to anything that we've got one here from Mohammed, and he stated on wealth taxes, the political argument obviously against it is that will lead to capital flight or potentially even tax avoidance. Does the modelling that you've done address this? Does it make any assumptions about capital flight, or is it based on a kind of closed economy?
Okay, brilliant. The model or the simulation we have done using the Wealth Assets and Liabilities Survey of Britain is looking at taxing all the assets at the same rate for the top 1%. So that includes business assets, machinery and capital, machinery and equipment, buildings, land, as well as financial assets. We are allowing for different degrees of tax evasion and avoidance. So capital flight would be sort of part of that. We didn't go to detail in terms of allowing for different rates of evasion for different assets. That's just a very it's a very novel. No one else has done that in terms of the simulation we have done, but we have basically assumed that it's average evasion. You're right that tax avoidance, tax evasion will be a lot higher for financial assets. On the other hand, when it comes to land, well, land is not mobile, so it will be very low. We are trying to look at taxing the assets, net assets, assets minus liabilities of the entire household to kind of avoid creative splitting of assets across household members. And it is therefore a lot more possible, particularly if you invest in administrative capacity, to tax land. When it comes to business assets, you could theorize that businesses will shut down and move out of Britain. But if you look at Brexit effect, well, of course, there has been maybe a decline in investment compared to what it could have been pre-Brexit. But there is still a lot of businesses. There are agglomeration effects. Britain is a large economy. It's an important economy. You're not going to pick up and go just because there is 1% tax on your assets. And if the government is using that to good purpose and investing in infrastructure, Britain will become a lot more of an attractive economy as well. So there are also going to be new investment opportunities. Obviously, if you're having this massive investment stimulus, 1% of GDP in the green economy, 1% in the care economy, well, that's a very attractive economy to invest in. So people, investors, businesses, entrepreneurs won't just pick up and leave such a vibrant environment. Financial assets might be a different matter. Hence, we are allowing for avoidance. Yeah, and on probably asset level, that will be higher for financial assets. Hence, all the more important to target all assets and not just finance, land as well as business assets, or for that matter, pension assets for the top 1%. Remember, that's households about 3.5 billion pounds of net wealth. Million pounds of net wealth. I think that, and I just want to repeat my one empirical finding at least. It's very interesting, but the top 1% of wealth is not the one that is creating a lot of investment. When you tax them, the investment coming from the rest of the economy, the other 99%, is actually being stimulated. There was a finding that strong a finding wasn't something I had theorized, but it is there, and I'm surprised and I'm learning from it. And this is probably because a lot of that wealth concentration is creating a barrier to entry for small and medium enterprises. So if some of that flies away because their financial assets and they're able to go elsewhere, this doesn't seem to be a very negative thing for the economy. We have to understand that the assets in that financialized top 1% segment is not returning back to the economy in terms of investment in real physical assets, machinery and capital and productivity and job creation. It's speculation. It's financialization. This isn't investment in the macro language. It is sheer financial activity, which is speculation. So they may go away, and this doesn't seem to be hurting private investment of the rest of the 99%. It seems to be even a good thing.
Okay, that's a really interesting finding. Thank you for such a thorough answer as well. So one of the things that I wanted to talk very briefly about, you've talked about this needs-based approach and focused on that at the beginning. And obviously there's a clear tension between the kind of public sector finance-based approach within that. So I was just wondering what you think might need to change for that paradigm shift to actually occur.
It's a very good question, isn't it? All those crises we have been experiencing, we've been moving from crisis to crisis, great financial crash, the pandemic, geopolitical crisis, cost of living crisis, and ever continuous and worsening climate crisis. One should think that it's like wake-up call enough and policies change. It isn't. There's a lot of short-termism and there's a lot of short-term vested interests. So I'm asking, for example, this question. We have clapped the nurses and care workers, other key workers, every night during the pandemic. The policymakers did that too. Government, cabinet ministers, prime minister, chancellor. So came 2022, and they are still so shy of increasing the wages of those nurses and care workers. They had lost a lot of real income since the great financial crash and austerity that followed it. Our hospitals were underinvested, both in physical infrastructure, in PPP terms, PP, personal protection equipment terms, but also in human infrastructure, nurses and doctors terms. Instead of seeing that and reversing all that, we are now telling them that they can't have a pay rise matching inflation. They have to just stomach more income losses on top of what I had lost anyway since 2010. And why is this the case? I'm asking myself now, if we are to increase nurses' wages or teachers' wages, doctors and rail workers' wages, these people are actually now working for a private sector. These are public sectors in broadly defined terms. And it's not like an input to immediately a private sector. So it's not going to reach to immediate price inflation either. But we are talking about it, or the government is talking about it, as if a rise in nurses' pay will lead to more inflation and we can't do it. That's wrong. But I do accept that when we increase nurses' wages as they would deserve, or teachers' wages, or invest in hire more nurses and teachers and more rail workers, invest in rail infrastructure and housing, all that spending will fund itself only to a certain extent. Well, that means we will have to tax someone. Then the question really becomes a political economy question. Two questions, political economy questions. One is, which tax rate are we going to increase? I'm saying we can raise 70 billion, at least if we tax the top 1%. But that top 1% is a very powerful political lobby. They own the newspapers and media channels, and I'm very thankful for Economic Research Council for giving space to unconventional views like mine, which are not being represented in the conventional media channels, isn't it? There is need for a lot more funding to really be able to reach out to people and express those very simple questions. Do we need to pay nurses more? Most people agree, actually. There is strong public opinion in favor of that. Well, which tax should increase? Let's have that discussion. Or is climate change a problem? Well, yes, but instead of that, there's a lot of vested investment by lobbyists into climate skepticism. They have more money than the scientists who try to reach out to us. I'm not a physical scientist or climate scientist, and I'm getting very little daily media input from their research. I'm getting a lot more casual distortion from climate skeptic media and social media. So those people who would lose from shutting down fossil fuels, who would lose from paying taxes to invest in the green economy or the care economy, have very strong, they are using all their assets to lobby for politicians who would block change, to lobby for media channels who create fake news or distort the scientific news. And, you know, such events where we create some economic literacy is very important, reaching out to broader, but there is need for really rank and file organizing and intervention, because I can only do so much from my office. Those findings have to reach out to people and have to turn into also campaigning tools, I think. This is why working with civil society organizations are very important, and political campaign groups are very important.
Thank you very much. I mean, I could sit here and talk all evening about this topic, to be honest. It's been incredibly interesting, but I'm also quite conscious that we've just gone over the 8 o'clock mark. So thank you very, very much for joining us this evening, Özlem. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about this topic. And to be honest, I hope to talk to you about it further, because I've got so many more questions that I've prepared to speak to you about. But no, thank you very much for this evening. And a recording of this will be made available. You'll get to see first, obviously. But to everybody else that has joined us, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for spending it with us today. And to Özlem, thank you very much for your insightful talk.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much.